Let's explain what's been going on, because things have moved very, very quickly. President Putin signed a decree recognising the independence of two breakaway regions of Ukraine that are controlled by Russian-backed separatists. He's ordered Russian troops into those regions, he says, to act as peacekeepers. Then, in the last few hours, the West responded. Boris Johnson announced asset freezes on 5 Russian banks and 3 high-net-worth individuals. And earlier today, the German chancellor, Olaf Scholz, said the country's suspending the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project with Russia. The news is contributing to a surge in oil prices, and there were some steep falls on stock markets at the start of the European trading day. European equities have rebounded as the day has progressed, but the question is, how well placed is Russia to withstand sanctions? Our global trade correspondent Chris Morris reports.
8 years ago, Russian troops moved into Crimea, annexing part of Ukraine. It provoked a first round of international sanctions, and it taught Moscow an important lesson. Since 2014, it's been setting up defences, moving away from the dollar and trying to sanction-proof the Russian economy. By January this year, the government's international reserves in foreign exchange and gold were at record levels, worth over $630 billion. And only about 16% of that foreign exchange is now actually held in dollars, down from 40% 5 years ago. There have also been other changes, with Russia relying less on foreign loans and investments, seeking new trade opportunities away from Western markets, creating its own system of international payments, and cutting the size of its budget. It could be a dangerous game for Moscow. Sanctions on Russian banks would hurt. But President Putin may be calculating that the US, the UK and the EU have slightly different strategic interests.
While in the short term the Russian economy might suffer, this is a specific type of trade war where we're trying to change actually the strategic behaviours of a country using trade measures and sanctions. And the risk of all of that is we miscalculate both the economic and the strategic costs of doing this.
Russia's huge foreign reserves could certainly be used to prop up its currency, the ruble, for quite a while. But other weaknesses can be exploited. So Russia may think it has to some extent inoculated itself against Western financial pressure at home. But is it vulnerable elsewhere? Here in London, for instance. For years, members of the Russian elite close to Vladimir Putin have used this city as a place to invest and to get money out of Moscow. It's become known as the London laundromat. It's a world of smoke and mirrors, front companies, property portfolios and political influence.
The US is actually trying to push Britain towards a tougher line on this dirty money.
The government has now promised to take decisive action, but many countries, including the UK, could have acted earlier.
The Western governments are not just failing the Russian people by allowing this to happen, they're also failing their own people. But change will happen if the sanctions are much more targeted against the so-called oligarchs.
So sanctions can have an impact, but a package as broad as this has never been imposed on an economy as large as Russia. The West would have to be in it for the long haul. Chris Morris, BBC News.
Well, let's speak to Rebecca Harding, the Chief Executive of Coriolis Technologies. Rebecca, in terms of your take on this, how much does this talk of sanctions and the sanctions we've seen put the financial sector on the front line of this conflict between Russia and the West?
I think what's interesting about all of this is that because we're using sanctions and because we are preventing certain types of individuals and organisations from operating in the UK or around the world, it actually means that banks have to be very careful not to touch those organisations. Otherwise, they run the risk of having some kind of sanction against themselves. So what it means is that banks are actually having to watch out for things like anti-money laundering, financial crime, fraud that might be associated with Russian interests. And that means that they're constantly having to look over their shoulder for anything that might affect them. So it does actually mean that they're being used almost as a strategic tool by government's foreign policy.
What we've seen so far are very specific, very targeted sanctions, particularly the UK's picking of 5 5 specific entities and high net worth, 3 high net worth individuals. What about something more wide-ranging? For example, what effect would it have if the West decided they were going to freeze Russia out of the SWIFT banking system that looks after all those transactions? I see your reaction there. That would be quite a big thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, that's a nuclear option. Because what it would do is it would mean that that Russian banks were effectively unplugged from the global financial system. Now, Russia has become less dependent on the US dollar over the last 5 or 6 years. It trades increasingly with China. But what's important about the SWIFT system is that it enables payments and trade finance payments all the way around the world. So if Russia were unplugged from that, it would become increasingly reliant on its own payment system. And it does have and has been building its own payment system. That's increasingly plugged into a Chinese system. So what it does effectively, if we went down that road, it would certainly create some very short-term difficulty for Russia. Longer term, we'd have to think about whether or not that's a wise move, because it would actually separate out the global financial system into these 2 different payment systems.
And as you mentioned, the prevalence of the dollar as the world's currency, it would have knock-on effects for that as well. Just changing topics slightly, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, Germany's move to suspend the opening of that at a time when Europe is facing an energy crisis and a shortage of gas. That's going to cause pain in both directions, isn't it?
So Nord Stream 2 is interesting because it's more of a political thing than an economic thing at the moment. You have to remember that Nord Stream 2 actually isn't putting any gas through the pipeline at the moment. It's been finished, but the German government itself hasn't actually agreed to go ahead with having its supply of energy through there. So it's a political move, and what it does is it says Germany is absolutely acting along with the European Union and with NATO and with all of the US and the UK to do something very strong in this sanctions space. So it will create problems in terms of politics.
OK. Rebecca Harding, Chief Executive of Coriolis Technologies, thanks very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Well, the news of the suspension of Nord Stream 2, as I was just saying, sent oil prices surging higher today. Have a look at this graph. You can see as the day progressed, look at that spike in the middle. It almost touched $100 a barrel. It has since kind of edged down a little bit, currently hovering around just over $97 a barrel. That's what oil is doing. Meanwhile, markets have been rather turbulent. There's been a lot of volatility. They lost some, made some losses, but then recouped some of that as the day wore on. Here's Samira Hussein in New York. And there she is. Yes, yeah, look, Samira.
Yeah. Yeah, look, if you look, U.S. financial markets actually opened just under 10 minutes ago, and we already saw that the Dow has fallen some 300%, and you're seeing that pressure on the energy markets, and it's not surprising. Of course, all of this has to do with the tensions in Ukraine, and and why that's happening. I mean, just listen to your previous guest who just talked about how reliant we all are globally to Russia and how much gas it puts into the pipeline. So, in one way, we do talk about how, at least here in America, that there is a lot more energy independence. But there are many analysts that would actually suggest, look, we're still interdependent. And if you look at the way that energy prices are going right now, I think that's a pretty clear evidence of that.